Thank you for attending this Zoom webinar from around the globe. My name is Kyoko Yoshinaga, and I'm the non-resident senior fellow at the Georgetown Institute for Technology, Law, and Policy. And I'm one of the founding members of this AI governance series. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this event, Management of Ethical AI, the State of the Art, co-hosted by the Wikimedia Yale Initiative on Intermediaries and Information at the Yale Law School's Information Society Project, the Georgetown Institute for Technology, Law, and Policy, and the Georgetown Global Tech Networking Group. Today's panel is on data ethics in AI. We'll be joined by 4 experts in this area, and our moderator today is Dennis Hirsch, who is a professor of law and director of the program on data and governance at the Ohio State University Moritz College of Law. Professor Hirsch is an expert in privacy law and in the law, policy, and ethics of AI, and has been a leading force in the discussion about data and data ethics for over a decade. He co-founded the Ohio Data Ethics Working Group in 2021, and he has recently published a paper, Business Data Ethics, Emerging Trends in the Governance of Advanced Analytics and AI, in the Ohio State Legal Studies research paper. With that, Dennis, please take it from here.
Thank you, Kyoko. And thanks to all the organizers of this webinar series on AI governance. Thanks to each of our panelists who generously are giving of their time to share their expertise with us today. I wanted to just mention that the program I direct at Ohio State, the program on data and governance, is a program both of the Ohio State Moritz College of Law and also of the Translational Data Analytics Institute at Ohio State, which is kind of the umbrella institute for all things data analytics at our university. Attempts to address AI's ills and so unlock its benefits began some years ago in the computer science and data science field with the development of techniques to achieve fair, accountable, and transparent artificial intelligence and machine learning. The focus then moved to the articulation of high-level AI ethics principles, such as justice, autonomy, and fairness, in the attempt to bring them into the development of AI. And more recently, we've seen the emergence of laws and policies to regulate AI and bring it more into line with human values. The European Union has proposed its AI Act, for example, and the Biden administration just released an AI Bill of Rights. All of this is productive and important, but there's something missing. How do you get data scientists in an organization to search for and apply AI ethics techniques? You do it through management. How do you institutionalize and operationalize high-level AI ethics principles? You do it through management. How do laws and policies, like requirements for algorithmic impact assessments, seek to promote more ethical AI? They do it by trying to impact management. So understanding what good AI ethics management is and how to achieve it is really a cornerstone to achieving more ethical AI. Yet this area has not received nearly as much academic or policy attention as some of the other aspects of this broader project. This panel focuses on AI ethics management. That is, it focuses on the organizational structures, standards, and processes that can promote more ethical use of AI. And for this purpose, we've brought together 4 leading thinkers about and practitioners of AI ethics management. Each has also, in addition to their expertise, which they're going to share with you today, each has written something interesting in this area. And I will mention those publications in their introductions and recommend them to you. So our speakers today, in alphabetical order, are Michael Akinwumi. Michael is the Chief Tech Equity Officer of the National Fair Housing Alliance, and there he leads the Alliance's Tech Equity Initiative, a multifaceted effort to increase the fairness of and reshape the design of algorithmic systems in the housing and financial services industries. Michael was the lead author of the National Fair Housing Alliance's Purpose, Process, and Monitoring Framework for auditing and mitigating risks in algorithmic systems. And I think we're going to put a link to that in the chat. I recommend it to you, and Michael will be talking about that in his presentation today. John Basl is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Northeastern University, where he also serves as Associate Director for AI and Data Ethics Initiatives at the Northeastern Ethics Institute. He's also an editorial board member for the new journal, AI and Ethics. John also has written really interesting and valuable material in this area. He co-authored reports on building data and AI ethics committees, and more recently, one on getting from commitment to content in AI and data ethics, justice and explainability. And we're going to put those links in the chat for you as well. Ilana Golbin is director in PwC Labs, where she serves as one of the leads for artificial intelligence. She specializes in applying machine learning and simulation modeling to address her clients' needs. Since 2018, she has led PwC's efforts globally in the development of cutting-edge approaches to build and deploy responsible AI, and was recently recognized in Forbes as one of 15 leaders advancing ethical AI. Ilana has done important writing in this area too. She was a major contributor to the World Economic Forum's report on empowering AI leadership, a C-suite toolkit, which has an excellent section on responsible AI. Finally, Irina Raicu is the director of the Internet Ethics Program at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University. There, her work focuses on a wide variety of issues, ranging from online privacy to net neutrality to data ethics. She's a member of the Partnership on AI's Working Group on Fair, Transparent, and Accountable AI, and she too is an author. This time she's co-author of the Markkula Institute's Ethics in Technology Practice series. So we'll put the links to each of these valuable publications in the chat. It's now my pleasure to turn the mic over to our panelists, and we'll go to Ilana first. I should mention that each of our panelists will speak, and then there will be time for audience Q&A. Please post your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I will read and organize the questions and we'll present them to our panelists. Ilana.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dennis. Thank you to Georgetown, to everyone for having us. I'm very honored to be part of this panel with my esteemed co-panelists. I'll go ahead and share my screen just for a few slides, which I'll mostly do to walk through a brief perspective around how organizations are broadly thinking about adopting AI governance practices. This is an area that, as Dennis mentioned, I've been focusing on for the past 7 or 8 years or so, is trying to understand how organizations can meaningfully adopt artificial intelligence capabilities while mitigating the risks that they might pose. And as part of that exercise, we survey our clients frequently to understand what topics are important to them, where their interests lie, also where some of their concerns are. And of some of these surveys, just a few statistics I wanted to quickly flash up on the screen. And I think what's most important here is that we observe that really few companies today are not impacted by the use of AI, and more broadly, the extension of that is the usage of data to serve a variety of analytical applications across their business. And thanks to, in part to many of these initiatives that my fellow panelists are part of, as well as the legal frameworks that are advancing, leaders across businesses are increasingly more aware that responsible AI and ethical AI is something that they need to be promoting within their organization. And it's not a distinct capability. It's something that is really embedded. But given that, it's still very, very challenging for many organizations to understand what that really means. Very few of them have any types of formal policies or strategies around tackling AI risk. The activities that have been undertaken are fairly ad hoc. Accountability structures are just not there. And partly this is because there's been quite a bit of confusion around what good practice looks like. First of all, what is AI is something that a lot of businesses have a challenge with, and getting the scope around what they should even be governing. Two, understanding what risks really are out there. But then three, what governance frameworks really will satisfy both the regulatory requirements that are coming, as well as what organizations believe they should be doing from an ethics perspective. So that is something that I think is a growing challenge. And one of the reasons why it's challenging to build governance frameworks around AI is because it's such a pervasive capability. It's not centralized in specific areas of the business. And because of that, the risks that can be posed from the use of these systems or the misapplication of these systems can be very extensive. In some sense, these risks are not new to businesses. They are risks that have been around for a long time. But for some AI applications, there are more novel risks that organizations just have not had the opportunity to evaluate how they would keep those in mind. I like to think of the risks attached to AI systems in two primary buckets. Ones that are specific to an individual application. That's what you see on the left-hand side of the graphic. But also ones that are much more extensive. They relate to how we believe technology should actually be used or impacting our lives, how it should be impacting our businesses, our customers, our constituents, our employees, and as well as the organizational structures that might be needed from a community perspective in order to address those risks. And that's what we see on the right-hand side. So I'll briefly go through this. I know there's a lot of content here and it's by no means exhaustive, but we look at things like performance risk and whether or not the systems are actually achieving the goals that we have set forth. Do we see that they are working well? Are they easy to understand? Are they stable, meaning do they perform consistently over a long period of time? From a security perspective, are there any additional opportunities for network intrusions that maybe we don't have visibility into because of the use of AI machine learning systems? Are we collecting more sensitive data because we're trying to feed some of these applications? What's the risk there? How can these systems be otherwise subverted in a way that we might not anticipate or appreciate? And then largely all of this comes back to what I think we're here to talk about, which is control. What governance do these organizations actually have in place, or do they have a perspective around that, what that governance should be? This is an area where, as I mentioned, many companies view an opportunity for improvement. The regulators are talking about, as Dennis mentioned, algorithmic impact assessments, using risk-based assessments for assessing specific applications and the governance practices that might come from that. But it is much easier to say that in language than it is to actually put that into practice, and that's where we see rubber hitting the road. A consequence of that is actually the alternative, which is some organizations are so worried about the risks and the inability to satisfy those risks that they've wholesale abandoned plans to utilize machine learning and AI capabilities, which I don't necessarily think is the answer. There's a pathway forward, and I think as a community, we're trying to draw that pathway forward. So what are some of these practices? There are existing organizational structures from a governance point of view that many companies already have. A 3 lines of defense model is a common governance framework. It positions a first line that's responsible for effectively doing business, the second line, which checks that business is done properly in accordance with standards and practices that are established across the enterprise, and a third line is responsible for quality assurance, making sure that those types of controls that are instantiated by the second line are effective and there aren't any gaps. And this 3 lines of a defense structure we've seen evolve to incorporate new skills, new practices to try and provide some of that accountability that we're looking for, and support of what the regulators are indicating as the primary goals of introducing accountability. So from a first line perspective, that would be thinking about what standard development procedures might be put in place for teams that are actually building or the teams that are buying applications. Many companies aren't building their own AI, they're acquiring it through vendors. This would be training and upskilling so that there's an appreciation at the point of doing business of what the potential risks are around AI and how to surface that up. From a second line perspective, around the different compliance and legal privacy and leadership functions, there is an introduction of a more technical second line, a group of individuals that can be there to effectively check and challenge the use of AI and machine learning across different types of applications, defining specific standards and specifications that make sense for AI systems, introducing concepts like algorithmic impact assessments or other types of documentation practices that could potentially be utilized. Importantly here, there's a lot that can already be built upon from existing privacy practices or existing ethics practices. And these are aligning on existing structures really is the best for success for a change management perspective, as we see. Within the third line, internal audit is kind of waiting and seeing, but there's a newer introduction of potentially the incorporation of ethicists, and one of the other panelists that will go a little bit deeper into ethics boards and the opportunity that ethics boards, either in a third line or as a completely external independent body, might serve in order to support the adoption of ethical practices for business. And I just want to leave on one last thought, which is that it's easy for us sometimes in these conversations to talk about the impact of systems once they're deployed and think about how we might be, communities might be impacted, we might be impacted, but that's all at the point of delivery of a specific system. And I want to reinforce that adopting effective governance for responsible AI is not just thinking about only the outcome. We have to think all the way from the beginning around what are the systems that we actually want to be building. It's much harder to stop a moving train than it is to not build the tracks at all, or whatever metaphor we want to be going off of. Thinking about strategically where we want to be investing our resources, how we want to be building AI from a programmatic standpoint or buying it from a programmatic standpoint, defining standards and other internal practices and standard operating procedures that we can all align on, establishes a better upfront context for the development of systems. It also establishes the right type of perspectives around how we determine the ultimate requirements for those systems, not just from a technical perspective, but also from a human perspective, from an ethics perspective, from a business perspective, and getting that alignment upfront before anything is built, before massive programs take off, is a great way to try and seed success. So with that, I know we have several other panelists. I want to make sure I give them enough time to go through their topics as well. Thank you, Dennis.
Thank you, Ilana. That's a really interesting point you ended with, kind of starting at the front end. It reminds me a little bit of pollution prevention strategies in the environmental area, kind of fix it at the front end rather than at the end of the line. Our next speaker is Michael.
Dennis, thanks for having me. And Ilana, thanks for covering the different risk aspect of AI solutions. So I'm going to briefly share, I'm going to share my screen. And so I'll briefly talk about the algorithmic auditing framework that we put together at the National Fair Housing Alliance. And we strongly believe that the framework will really help to mitigate or identify risks that are associated with AI. Now, when it comes to algorithmic auditing or auditing of AI solutions or machine learning solutions, we know that it is no longer an academic exercise. So there is a lot of news about the impact or discriminatory impact of algorithmic solutions. Now, with those impact or discriminatory impact are also benefits that are associated with algorithmic solutions. For example, in housing, we've seen how algorithmic solutions could actually expand access to credit solutions, especially for those who are typically underrepresented in housing data or in lending data. And talking about benefits, we also know that as you use machine learning solutions to scale algorithmic benefits, there is also a tendency or a potential to scale those risks. And some of the risks were already covered by Ilana in the prior presentation, but I'd also like to mention in passing that there are regulatory risks, there are also legal risks, there are financial risks, and there are reputational risks. Now, knowing that choosing between algorithmic benefits and also risk is not really an option because algorithmic solutions are already here to stay, that was what actually motivated us to create a framework that could be used to identify all these different risks and also mitigate or manage those risks. And the framework we created is called a PPM, which is a Purpose Process Monitoring Framework. And with that, so we believe that any algorithmic auditing framework should answer 3 questions. And those questions are what, how, and when. So the very first part is what. So when you're trying to build an algorithmic solution that is driven either by data or purely by your model, then you want to ask questions about what is the problem that you're solving. Now, there are situations where those problems actually have stakeholders reviewing the ethical implications of solving or working on them. And this conversation could include product managers or project managers or business analysts or even frontline workers. So we believe that when it comes to the purpose element of the framework, many questions around the problem that is being solved should be handled at that stage. For example, it's possible for the team to actually decide that probably the problem is not even amenable to a machine learning solution. Now, followed by questions around how the problem is going to be represented by data. We all know for a fact that without data, we can't be talking about machine learning solutions or algorithmic solution. So, and there are a lot of instances where the problem may actually appear to be appealing, but there is no data to actually represent that problem. So we believe that management structures that is going to be efficient or effective in identifying risk associated with our AI or algorithmic solution should also consider how data represents the problem. Now, going back to how, so assuming that at the purpose stage, the stakeholders already agree that this is a problem that is worth solving, and we have the right data to solve the problem, then the question is, what teams are putting the solution together? What decision are they making regarding the data, deciding what features or variables are going into the algorithmic solution, regarding what models to actually use? So those who have a tech background, especially when it comes to math or data science, you know that there's a lot of options when it comes to choosing models. And that's why an effective management structure should actually consider impact at all these decision points. Impact when it comes to the data, when it comes to the model selection, and also impact when it comes to the outcome. Now, there are instances where some of the big tech companies, they've really gone ahead to propose frameworks for mitigating AI risk. And some of those frameworks also have different confusing metrics when it comes to how to actually evaluate the outcome of the system. And that's why we believe that with the PPM framework, you can actually have a more robust management framework to evaluate the outcome that is coming out of the system. Now, the third question that an effective auditing framework should answer is when. Gone are the days where we think when you develop a statistical model or a machine learning solution, then you can just, the lifetime is eternal. We know that the business environment where these solutions are deployed is very dynamic. So once your solution is in operation, the underlying data that actually fuel the models keeps changing. And that's why we believe that there should also be a monitoring component in any management framework that plans to effectively identify and mitigate risks that are associated with algorithmic solution. For example, once the model is deployed, there should be conversations or even involvement of product managers and frontline workers to continuously monitor the signals that are coming from the system so that they can actually use that signals to inform when to rebuild or retrain the models. And that's really an overview of what the PPM framework is. And I'll pass it on back to Dennis, and I'm sure there will be questions for us to actually delve deeper into the framework. Dennis, over to you.
Thank you, Michael, for that really interesting presentation. And I think you're starting to kind of unpack, some of the ideas that Ilana was introducing. So thank you for that. We'll turn now to John.
Thanks, Dennis. Thanks, everyone, for joining. I'm going to also share my screen. 1 second. So thanks, everyone, for joining. I'm going to talk a little bit about my work on AI and data ethics committees, which is based on this report.
You're a little soft. If you can increase your volume a little bit, I think.
How about now?
That's better. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, no problem. Never had that problem before. Sorry. Mike doesn't want to sit still. Okay, so this is based on work I've done on building AI and data ethics committees. I just want to start by saying they're just one piece of not only AI management practices, but of a much larger ethics ecosystem in the whole space that we need to cultivate for AI and data and big data analytics. But I do think they're an especially useful tool, and I think they're an especially useful tool right now, partly because even though there's growing regulatory guidance, it's often unclear or ambiguous, and you have to figure out how to navigate it or realize it. Even once we have clearer regulation, there will still be a space for ethics that's not just compliance with the law. But also because we currently lack sufficient interdisciplinary expertise and a common language between practitioners that they can use to advocate for and protect and promote appropriate values. So I think ethics committees can help with that problem. Some virtues of ethics committees is that they can bring, in the absence of those things, can bring together people with a broad range of expertise, technical, ethical, legal, organizational, but also the voices of other stakeholders that are impacted by these technologies to sort through the ethical dimensions of these challenges in the development of applications or even in fundamental research. They can be responsive in ways that sort of strict compliance with set rules can't be to rapid advances in the technology space. So a compliance-based model is sort of always lagging, whereas a committee-based model, you can really sort of keep up with the speed of things. They can help to develop standards and help us to figure out how to operationalize key principles that we want to sort of figure out the content of. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And depending on how a committee is implemented, they can really constitute a governance tool for an organization that serves as a repository for institutional knowledge, because they have a long trajectory and you sort of build up these governance practices and you have a history of those things amongst the members. Now, one approach to committee-based oversight that we've seen fail is to just get a bunch of experts and throw them in a room together and call them your ethics committee, and that's a recipe, I think, for failure. So committee-based oversight to be done well has to be employed carefully. And we do have other models. So we use committee-based oversight in human subject research, in animal subject research, in human embryonic stem cell research. And we can borrow insights from those models, but we can't just adopt them. So there's really some work to do if we actually want to do effective committee-based oversight. So in the report, we walk through a process of key questions across a series of different dimensions to help organizations or institutions develop ethics committees. I'm not going to read through this entire slide, but I'll keep the slide up while I say a bit about the key dimensions and some permutations. So first, the first thing we advocate for is starting with a clear goal for your committee. What is it? What is its institutional function? What is its goal within the organization broadly? What do you want it to achieve? Because that's going to help you answer a bunch of downstream questions about how you staff it and what their purview is and what the policies are going to look like. Second, you have to decide on some ethical content. In the case of animal subject research, for example, the values that we want to promote and protect are the welfare of animals and the value of scientific research. And then the specific tasks of the committee are defined in part by thinking about how to realize those values in practice. So a process happens where we move from a commitment to our principles to a commitment to specific operationalizations of those principles. And then the committee sort of is the thing that realizes that ethical content in some way. Third dimension, you need to figure out who should be on the committee, not only which expertise is needed, like technical, legal, ethical, but how can you organize the committee to promote and protect key values for avoiding bias or getting stakeholder feedback? So should you have a member, an external member on your committee? How can you make that work given IP problems, things like that? Fourth, you need to decide on the authorities of the committee and how the organization will make use of them. So you could decide, will going to the committee with a problem be voluntary? So are they consultory in nature, or will everybody will certain subsets of your organization be mandated to get something approved by the committee before they go forward with it? Finally, you need to settle on specific procedures and governance, like what does a protocol look like? Like when people want to submit to an IRB or an IACUC, that's how we handle human and animal subject research. There's a very specific protocol that gets submitted so that the review board can look at it. So what are the standards? What are the voting mechanisms going to look like? What are the nitty-gritty operations and procedures of the committee going to look like? So the report walks through all these dimensions, talking about what kinds of questions you have to ask for your own organization if you want to build such a committee. I want to close by just emphasizing that the committee-based approach can't be all there is to responsible AI management or ethical AI. And that's come out in the previous discussions already. Like we need auditing, we need multiple lines of defense. But as an example for figuring out the ethical content, moving from our foundational values to core principles to substantive content is a significant task. Tons and tons of organizations have their ethical principles. They're committed to fairness and transparency and non-bias or whatever. But that really doesn't tell on-the-ground workers what to do, and it wouldn't tell an oversight committee what they should do when they're deciding whether to approve some kind of work. We have to move towards those operationalizations, but you got to realize that a committee that's tasked with that job, you could build a committee to work through figuring out how to move from your foundational commitments to your operationalizations. But that's a very different organizational function than having a committee whose job is to figure out, are we living up to our organizational commitments? So figuring out what the practices look like is a very different thing from evaluating whether or not a given application or a given research project realizes those values. So you got to think about those projects differently. You can use multiple committees to solve these problems, but there's significant other elements that you have to conduct rather than just implementing this piece. But I do think it's a very useful piece. All right, I'll stop there.
Great, John. Thank you very much. And I think it's particularly interesting the way you talked about borrowing insights from other fields like bioethics. And I noted that Ilana did as well in thinking about how to develop these governance structures. So you don't have to start from scratch. There's other work from related fields to be built on. Last but not least, we will turn to Irina.
Yeah, so another reason why you don't have to start from scratch is that there are increasingly resources out there, one of them being the one I'm about to talk about. And I just wanted to say I really appreciate how we are sort of drilling down further and further into the details with these presentations. And I wanted to reiterate that all of the papers listed in the chat and the resources would really go far deeper than what we can just sort of, sketch in our short presentations. So we've talked about, risks and company mission and values and principles. And now I want to talk about that last part that John mentioned, which is what are the tools that we can put in place that really need to be put in place if we want to operationalize those principles, if they're going to move to actual implementation. So the center where I work back in 2018 published a suite of materials called Ethics in Technology Practice. I am a co-author of several of those tools, but I'm going to talk today specifically about something called an ethical toolkit, which was written by my then colleague, philosopher Shannon Valor, who is now at the University of Edinburgh. So for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to be largely channeling Shannon, although with my sort of embroidering on the side. So this is a series of 8 tools or 8 processes that are intended as concrete ways of implementing ethical reflection, deliberation, and judgment into engineering and design workflows. And I will add into just general development and deployment processes. So let me just tell you what the 8 tools are, and I think you'll see how they fit in with what we've been talking about already, and maybe introduce a couple of new things. The first one we call ethical risk sweeping, and we've already talked about the variety of risks, but ethical risk is anything that will cause harm to people, organizations, or other entities that have important moral status. And so aside from sweeping for those various other kinds of risks, focusing on the ethical risk is a good way to prevent some of the things that can go wrong down the line. And other tools are ethical premortems and postmortems if needed. Again, these are not new things. People are familiar with postmortems in other areas. Premortems would be a little bit like risk sweeping, but instead of sweeping for the risks associated with a particular product or feature, you're trying to sort of risk sweep the system. Try to look ahead and figure out how things could go wrong, even if the various components might be done well. So sort of systemic cascading failures, if you can anticipate those, that requires a slightly different analysis. The third tool would be, is called expanding the ethical circle. And this is where you look for all of the stakeholders that will be directly and indirectly impacted by an AI product. And you really consider whether you've taken their perspectives and experiences into consideration, and really whether you've actually asked them, not just tried to imagine how they might feel or what their concerns might be, but have you actually listened to the people who will be impacted. The word expanding there is really important, right? You have to think broadly about that impact, since we know that AI systems have impacts way down the line on a lot of people. The fourth tool is case-based analysis. And this is where, again, teams who are developing, I think, do this inherently anyway, but maybe more consciously think about what are paradigmatic similar cases. By now, for example, we know that facial recognition is biased in terms of race, and various companies have been making efforts to try to fix that. And so people are aware of that problem. When you're about to build an AI system or an AI model, what are some similar cases you can look at and learn from as a team? How are they similar? How are they different from what you're trying to build? That kind of analysis and that kind of skill is really important to develop as an ethical skill. The next tool, Shannon called Think of the Terrible People. And I think, again, this is something that increasingly companies are doing. Basically, how might your tools be misused or used in not necessarily misused even intentionally for bad means, but used by people in ways that could be harmful, even if they didn't intend them to be harmful, and try to mitigate for those harms. Remembering the ethical benefits of creative work is another such process or tool. And I think this is more rarely flagged as an issue. The fact that we've now learned to look to ethics to kind of identify harms and try to prevent them. But ethics is very much about human flourishing, about making things better, about helping people live the good life. And so as technologists are developing a new AI system, going through data sets, keeping those things in mind as well. And the fact that ethics is not just about the negative side is really important. So at various points, remembering why you're building something in the first place, and hopefully not just because the company is trying to make money. The ethical postmortems I mentioned, if something goes wrong, then that is a deeply important opportunity to learn from whatever it was. And in a sense, you are treating your own problematic product or feature as a case study, and developing kind of a library of case studies about things that went well and went wrong is really helpful in terms of any organization, so that future technologists can take a look at these analyses by prior teams. And last but not least, and again, this has come up in several presentations already, it's closing the loop, ethical feedback and iteration. That ethics is not something that sort of gets checked off and done and you move on to something else. I'm going to quote you from something that, again, Shannon wrote. She wrote, quote, "Because society is always changing and we with it, the ethical impact of technology is always a moving target. This is even more so because technology itself continually reshapes the social context and the people in it. A device or piece of software whose design is robustly ethical on its launch date may be unethical 2 years later if the social conditions and user base have changed enough that its impact is no longer conducive to human flourishing." So Michael talked about monitoring, and this is why we would be doing that monitoring. I think with all of these sort of processes, tools, whatever you want to call them, it's important to keep in mind that, you know, again, you can go to our website and see a list and descriptions and examples of these, but it's really important that team project leaders reflect carefully how each of them can be used in their team or project settings. We realize that these have to be heavily customized, right? So we're just sort of suggesting the rough outlines, and then they will have to be digested by different companies in different ways. And there are 3 questions that I think are really important when deploying such tools. One is, how often should this tool be used? Again, we're not saying that you do this once and you're sort of done with that part of the process. You might have to do it at multiple points. In what ways should the use of the tool and of the outcomes be documented and evaluated? Again, if you're not documenting and evaluating, you're not really doing the work. And how will we reward and incentivize good use of these tools? Just having the principles is not enough. Just having the processes is not enough either, right? So one more quote from Shannon, because I think it's just too good not to repeat. She wrote, "How will ethical audit feedback get analyzed and communicated and used in the next design cycle? Who will be accountable for closing the loop? Who is accountable for ethical design overall? A company with a value statement, a chief ethics officer, and a mandatory ethics onboarding training, but which does nothing to formally operationalize and incentivize ethical practice, is relying on little more than ethics vaporware." And this is where we hear accusations sometimes against companies of things like ethics washing. And if you combine that with a vaporware metaphor, you get ethics steam cleaning or something, because again, you can implement all of these things that we just talked about and not really be doing the work. So how do you put enough things in place that you will not be accused of ethics washing and you will actually be doing what you are claiming to do? I think is a real challenge. And I want to throw also kind of a caution there that I think sometimes it can be hard to distinguish between ethics washing and incipient efforts. So if a company is starting to take steps, then they're not enough, and outside critics know that they're not enough. Immediately calling it ethics washing can really sort of squash those internal efforts, right? The companies, will freak out and they might sort of die on the vine. So I would say it's worth giving companies a little bit of time. And then if they're still not doing what you think would be enough, or, if it's been a long time and the sort of negative outcomes keep coming, then I think it's absolutely fair to call efforts ethics washing if they're sort of invoking the terminology of ethics or principles, but not really living up to them. But I think we also have to accept the fact that a lot of companies are sort of just starting this process, and that the early parts of the process might look like ethics washing. I think that's kind of an interesting challenge that we're all watching or dealing with right now. And I'm going to stop there and look forward to questions.
Thank you, Irina. You've offered a lot of really interesting steps that organizations might take to start to do better in this area. We do have a couple of questions from the audience, so I'm gonna pose those. First of all, one of our audience members asks or points out the fact that data analytics and AI are really premised on induction, on looking at a set of past experiences to project the future, and that itself is problematic and contested, whether that's possible. And the question is, taking that into account, how would the panelists evaluate the problem of induction of AI methods, especially machine learning, from an ethical point of view in a society with different and conflictive interests?
How do you want to manage this, Dennis? I've got thoughts. Irina's got thoughts.
Let's see. I tell you what, John, why don't you start? And then if you guys can just signal me and I'll call on you.
Okay, I'll try to be quick. Maybe I'll let Irina pick up on the, how do you manage the conflict between ethical views? And I just want to say something about induction. Part of the problem is that they're just merely operating on induction, and responsible decision-making is not purely inductive. So human decision makers can recognize that some pieces of evidence that might be part of every data set are morally inadmissible for a given kind of decision. So we don't just engage in induction in decision making. And the problem is that a machine learning system purely engages in induction. And importantly, they only can engage on induction over a certain set of evidence. There's a certain kind of evidence that they can take as inputs. And sometimes we think there's highly relevant kinds of evidence that are ethically relevant that we should take into account that they can't. So I actually think part of the problem is just that they can only do a very limited kind of induction. So just thinking about ethics means thinking about what's the scope of evidence that's morally relevant and not just what's the scope of evidence. So, Irina.
Interesting.
Yeah, and what I would add to that is that I think induction is much less problematic in some areas than others, right? So if you're using AI to analyze, weather patterns, I'm not concerned about inductions about future weather patterns. I think it can be very useful and it's not immoral, right? If you're trying to do predictions about what human beings will do, I have a lot of problems with that. And it fails at that. We know that it does, right? So I think one key issue is to differentiate between, what kind of data are we talking about? Is it data about human beings? Very different bucket than everything else. So there are a lot of extremely, wonderful ethical uses of AI that have nothing to do with data about human beings. And I think we really have to treat those separately, right? They can really improve human flourishing, and it's okay to draw conclusions from past patterns because the patterns do repeat. If you believe in free will and the fact that the context that we live in changes us, then that humans, even if some people think we're very predictable, really are not in the way that AI would claim we are.
Great. So we had another question about learning management systems and kind of the use of artificial intelligence in schools and applied to students, and raising ethical questions about that. Have you guys thought at all about that, and what might some of the ethical issues in that area be, and how might one deal with them?
I can start, even though I'm admittedly not the closest to the education system. I know that the rest of you are actively working within that space, but just from an observer's point of view, there are going to be issues around privacy. So a lot of these are children. If you could talk about college age students being above the age of 18, and maybe there's a difference there, but when you're talking about artificial intelligence systems, or really any technology of any kind that's targeted toward children, we have to be a little bit more careful about the systems that we're promoting and the controls that we have in place there. What data is being collected, for what purpose is that data being collected? Can you meaningfully gain consent from a child about whether or not they're interfacing with that system appropriately? So I think that's certainly just a general risk that exists. And certainly a lot of the, not a lot, but several regulatory frameworks that have been emerging are focusing specifically on children and protecting children in online spaces and with other types of technology. So that's I think one. More broadly though, I think the question about, I think there are a few different aspects here. There's AI in the sense that there are systems that are providing recommended learning paths and guided learning paths and providing people with access to different content that maybe they would have never been exposed to. And so that has both potential pros and cons, just in terms of the curation and the limitation of the exposure of information, but also potentially pushing people to think about concepts that they haven't before. So that's one aspect. But then the other one is AI used in like automated grading and everything like that, where we've seen that people have become really creative in terms of ways to try and fool or circumvent those systems. So I think with any environment, with any context, just being really mindful about what we're promoting and what we're advancing and who could potentially be harmed and why is something we need to think about.
Great. Michael.
Yeah, so thanks for covering the privacy implication or the privacy aspect of the question. What I just like to add as an additional risk there, especially even looking at it from an ethics perspective, is bordering on creativity, right? Again, depending on what the use cases are. So you could imagine a typical situation where a student is using a learning management system, for example, to solve a problem. And the question is, who are you actually grading when it comes to evaluating the solution? And the other time, Irina mentioned that it's very important to actually look at the social implications of some of these systems that we're talking about, right? So we also need to actually factor in how such systems may or may not be used, given the fact that they may actually be limiting the collective creative capacity of the society as a whole.
Great, thank you. John.
Yeah, I'll just say something briefly about the side of plagiarism management or like things like that, not the privacy side of like monitoring students, which is a separate domain. It's not the first time that an emerging technology has degraded the value of a certain source of information. So Photoshop degraded the value of photo information because it became accessible that people could edit these things. And in each case, you have to look at a broad range of technological and social solutions to that. So like teaching educators how to build better assignments that don't require just taking a test. So this, for the first time ever, it's easy to be a philosopher. It's easy for me to come up with forms of evaluation that aren't massive tests that prove memorization of material. I think it's important that medical students memorize all sorts of material, and how you come up with tests of their memory that aren't just a standard test that you could cheat with an AI, I don't know yet. But we faced problems of this type before, and I'm optimistic that there's a combination of socio-technical solutions that can help us resolve this.
Great, thank you. Another question.
Dennis? Yes. Can I throw something in? And not on this question. I know we want to move on, but just so I don't lose it, I wanted to flag when Ilana was talking about various risks, and she was looking at sort of individual business risk versus national level risk. The one part that I thought was missing on that slide was global risk. We have not been talking about the environmental impact of AI. As a risk that we all need to be taken. And it's one of those issues when we talk about AI ethics that often just doesn't get mentioned at all. So I think sustainability and the environmental effects of deploying AI everywhere, whether it's the right solution for a problem or not, are vast, and they just need to be included in these conversations.
I completely agree with you, Irina.
I thought I know, I'm just saying, like, throw that into the slide, but I know that all of us care deeply about that. And I think sometimes there's so many different issues that it's hard to keep track of. I just wanted to make sure that we don't lose that one.
Yeah, so I just like to also briefly chime in on one of the risk aspects that I also deeply care about. I know Ilana might already cover this just under social risk, but I think it would be nice to also call out consumer risk, because, for example, we talk about enterprise risk and or even model risk, right? But then when it comes to, before you even evaluate or aggregate the impact of some of these machine learning solutions at the societal level, we think it's also important to actually call out the impact on consumers. So probably also had some session on consumer risk.
Are there any other comments that panelists would like to make on the others' presentations, or anything that's been said thus far before we move on to the next question?
Yeah, I just have one more thing I want to add, if I can, sorry,
Sure.
Is that I think one of the things I struggle with sometimes is that we provide a lot of emphasis on models not performing up to what we would believe as effectively perfect performance. But I think we also forget that humans are incredibly we're not infallible, right? So we're incredibly problematic. We've caused a lot of these problems. That's one of the reasons why models can have a really hard time learning off of our past behaviors, is because we have deeply entrenched biases. Unfortunately, as a society, we have very problematic views on shortcuts that we might take for every type of evaluations. We've historically always tried to find ways to circumvent any type of automated system. So I think that we need to have a little bit more attention as well on. Sometimes there's this de facto, well, if it's a high-risk system, you have to put a human in the loop. And I'm actually worried that that's not an appropriate position for us to take, because it puts a lot on us when we haven't really been up to the bar yet. So I think that's just one thing I wanted to propose to this panel. Maybe if you guys have any comments or thoughts on that, because it is a difficult space. No system is perfect. No person is perfect. No technology is perfect. So how do we advance meaningful tech and also mitigate risk, but also think about how people can be involved, but not put too much expectation on that solving all kinds of issues.
We're getting a really interesting conversation going here, which is fantastic. I want to add, we got 3 more comments from our panelists. I want to ask each of you to be quick, just because we only have 2 minutes left. So Michael, first.
Thanks. So I'll just briefly cover some comment on induction, and then also some comment on using existing frameworks like John and Irina mentioned. So with, let's say, some frameworks that you have in bioethics, and now speaking directly to my experience developing models in infectious diseases setting, I know that when it comes to effective management framework for mitigating AI risk, one of the areas to be covered is privacy. And I know, coming from medical or infectious diseases background, they really have extreme privacy concerns or solutions. So I just want to say that when it comes to balancing the benefits associated with AI and also the risk, there may be a need to actually adopt or customize some of these programs so that we don't necessarily limit innovation. And the second point I also like to make is on the induction side is, I think John already covered this, but I also like to say in terms of limitations, when it comes to machine learning solutions, the limitation is always based on, well, you only have your learning experience, which is represented in the data. But one of the reasons to actually overcome some of these limitations is why we're calling for monitoring, which really essentially compares the data that you have in your production environment with what was actually used. So to the degree that the patterns in those 2 environments are similar, then at least one may continue to use a machine learning solution. And now back to Ilana's comment about the role that the prejudice roles that humans have actually played in creating some of this data. What I like to say is AI can only reflect the biases, the discriminations that is already present in the data. And we can talk offline about some of the work we're doing in using AI to repair some of these damages that were actually introduced or caused by humans. Thanks.
We're going to need to let that be the last word. Appreciate all the input from our panelists, all the interesting comments. I'm going to turn it over to Mehtab Khan for the closing.
Thank you so much to the panelists and our speakers today. Thank you so much, Dennis, for leading the discussion. And thank you for the audience members for joining us today and for your thoughtful questions. Please join us at our next event on December 2nd on the AI Bill of Rights with Suresh Venkatasubramaniam. And please follow our Twitter pages, Yale ISP and Georgetown Tech, for more updates. Thank you so much, everyone.